Hey, we're here in Austin, Texas, and I'm joined by Steve Corona, who is going to talk about what he's working on nowadays. Now, a couple years back, we had a Skelly Code episode with Steve where he came on the show and he talked about his experience being the CTO at TwitPic, as well as a chief architect at BigCommerce. But today, he is an author and a startup advisor, so we're gonna talk about his experiences in the past as well as what he's working on today, because he's got some really cool and interesting projects that he's working on with cryptocurrency and a lot of other things. So we'll be covering all those different topics, and I can't wait to show you what that looks like. Hey Steve, thanks so much for letting us be in your condo today. I really appreciate it. Let's just dive right in and let's talk about what you're working on nowadays.
About 2 years ago, I was burnt out of living in Silicon Valley, and I had been planning to do this thing called a mini retirement. So I'd been saving up for a few years, and my plan was that when I turned 30, I was gonna take a year off and spend a year traveling, kind of figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I think that a lot of people, they wait till they're 65 to retire, and my philosophy was like, why don't I do a sort of small retirement earlier on in my life? And I had turned 29, and I was like, man, I really don't want to wait another year to do this mini retirement. So around that time, I left the Bay Area and I spent a year traveling and kind of figuring out what I wanted to do with my time, and got into a bunch of projects and learned a lot about myself.
So you mentioned that traveling was one of your life goals. What is it about traveling that really attracted you, and why did you want to do that as one of your life goals?
I've read a lot about books about people that just, lived out of a suitcase and kind of just went with the wind and lived life in a way where it wasn't as structured. And I had been living just a very rigid sort of startup, life where you're working insane hours and you're kind of putting off enjoyment for the future. And something about just living out of a suitcase, doing what you wanted, waking up late, was really, really appealing to me at the time. And I was like, man, like traveling is the key, and being able to see different parts of the country. And I really wanted to explore the US because I had lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, but I hadn't seen much in between, and there was so many cities. So just like got sucked into that, and I actually took my cat with me and lived out of different Airbnbs in different cities a week at a time.
So out of that entire traveling experience, was there just one thing that really stands out as making the entire trip worth it?
Yeah, I think the coolest thing when I think about it, where I'm like, I would definitely do that again in a heartbeat. And this, I don't think it sounds that cool, but the experience was just amazing, was taking an Amtrak from San Francisco to New York City. And it was 5 days on a train. You fell asleep in a sleeper car, and maybe you fell asleep sort of like going through a city, and you'd wake up in the Rocky Mountains, and you'd go to sleep again, and you'd wake up in the plains. And it was just this incredible experience to kind of see the entire country outside your window at 50 miles an hour. And also the people you meet on a train are just these, every walk of life, some nut jobs, some like super interesting people, and everything in between. It was that was the coolest part of the trip and of the experience, living on a train for 5 days.
So like I mentioned, we are in your condo here in Austin, Texas, but I know that you used to live in San Francisco. Even before that, you were in Charleston, South Carolina. So why did you pick Austin? I know this is a beautiful view, but was there anything else that really attracted you to this beautiful city?
For me, Austin always represented this amazing culture and environment that I would travel to often for work, and I would look forward to all of those trips. And so it just always had this very happy place in the back of my mind. And when I was thinking about where I wanted to kind of settle down and put down roots after moving out of the Bay Area, I knew that I didn't want a city that was, the Bay Area has this sort of grind to it. It's got this culture where everyone wants to do the same things, and everyone's in tech, and you're just living and breathing tech 24/7. And I knew I didn't want that. I wanted somewhere that was a little bit more expansive, with a lot of room, and there's a lot of room in Texas. Somewhere that the people, the culture was a bunch of different kind of walks of life, more of a mixing pot. I think you have that here in Austin. And then Austin is just this warm, up-and-coming city with a lot of potential. And a lot of people will tell you, if you meet natives, they'll say, Austin is full. Like, we are full, do not move here. And I disagree. Like, Austin is just getting started, and I think that people that live here say the city has changed so much in the past 10 years, and I think that the next 10 years are going to be likewise a same change. So I just think that there's a lot of potential here. The culture is really cool. The tech scene is just getting started. There's a lot of cool companies, a lot of cool people. It's awesome, man. I love it here.
So it's funny, I recently read this article that says that Austin, Texas is where Silicon Valley used to be 20 years ago. Do you think that's the case? And what does that really mean for the culture here?
I wasn't around 20 years ago, and I wasn't in Silicon Valley in the early days. I do feel like in Austin, the things that I dislike about the San Francisco startup culture, where it's all just heavily driven on ego and VC money and this environment where there's a lot of what's the word? Just a lot of show, right? I feel like Austin doesn't have that disease as much, where the companies in Austin and the startups here, just as a rule of thumb, right? Not saying every company in SF is bad or ego-driven, but here they feel more like real businesses that have a sustainable model, a sustainable revenue model. It's a little bit more difficult to raise money here, and I think that kind of is a forcing function where the companies here have to be a little bit less like these crazy tech startups that you read about, and more like the Fortune 500 style companies, and built in that way. So I think the word I would use is like sustainable to describe the tech culture here. And I don't know, that kind of seems the opposite of what the Bay Area, what I imagine what it was like 20 years ago. I imagine that being like gasoline or money as gasoline just being poured on this fire. I don't see that as much here. I think that the culture here is long-term ends up being more healthy, more sustainable, more enjoyable for the people that are working in those companies.
You mentioned in addition to traveling, you also poured a lot of your time into various kinds of projects. What are some of those projects that you've been working on?
I really got into different new tech. I had a whole laundry list of different tech I wanted to learn. And the way that I learn things is by doing stuff, by doing something, getting my hands dirty with it. So I was looking at different tech like machine learning, Elixir. There's a lot of stuff on the cloud that I had seen that I wanted to mess around with, but I hadn't had a good opportunity to, and started building like weird little apps and different things for like Raspberry Pis and stuff. And then one day I just got into cryptocurrency. It was just like one day it was like, like there's that Bitcoin thing. And I had owned some Bitcoin in the sense that like I had bought stuff online with Bitcoin, and if you do the math now, it was like this $100 thing I bought at the time, I spent $200,000 worth of Bitcoin now at today's price of Bitcoin, right? That's like all I had known about cryptocurrency, but started learning more about it and got like really into it. I mean, like just went down this rabbit hole, and then started building tools and programs to help my day-to-day sort of cryptocurrency things that I was doing, using all the new technology that I wanted to get my hands dirty with. So like Elixir and Docker and new AWS tools and Kubernetes and all this kind of stuff. Like I got into that because I found that project that sort of drove, my ability to like sink my teeth into something and start playing with all the cool technology that I wanted to.
What is it about cryptocurrencies that really grabbed your attention, and why did you want to spend so much time in it?
Cryptocurrency is this idea of like distributed trust, or like a distributed ledger, where you can use it as a payment system because you can trust that the ledger that everyone keeps is honest, and that you're not saying that you have a certain amount of coins when you actually don't, because of the way the math works out. Like you can trust that if you show me on the blockchain, you make a transaction, you send me Bitcoins, I can trust that you actually did that and that you're not going to go spend them somewhere else, right? I will say I'm not the world's biggest Bitcoin expert or the biggest cryptocurrency expert, but I think it's really interesting. And there's a lot of people that write it off, that look at cryptocurrency and say, hey, that's like the tulip, but I think it's the Dutch tulip bubble, where like tulips went to these crazy prices. And Bitcoin as like one of the cryptocurrencies. There's many cryptocurrencies, right? You think of crypto and you think of Bitcoin, but there's actually hundreds of other coins out there that have prices from tenths of a cent all the way up to hundreds of dollars per coin. And so I think that, when you look at crypto, you hear Bitcoin. Bitcoin is like the alpha or like the beta of what cryptocurrency and the blockchain, which cryptocurrency is based on, can be. So Bitcoin is just like, this is our first go at it, and there's a lot of problems with it. It kind of sucks. There's a lot of manipulation, but the fundamental blockchain is really interesting from a technical perspective. A lot of banks are starting to implement or look at different ways to use blockchain to facilitate. Maybe like Bank A wants to move money to Bank B, and instead, right now they use ACH. Maybe blockchain can replace that. Or I've heard about like shipping container companies that use the blockchain to track where their shipping containers are in the world, and being able to update this ledger of all the containers in a distributed fashion. So I think the underlying technology is really cool. So what caught my attention with cryptocurrency, with Bitcoin, is that you can trade it like you would trade a stock, right? There's a whole system of exchanges where you can buy and sell. Like you might buy a share of Apple for a certain price and then sell it in the future for another price. You can do that with the coins and with all the cryptocurrency. And I had never really done any of trading with the stock market in the past. And I had looked at this, and you're kind of blown away because there's millions of transactions happening in the span of minutes. It's this really high scale problem. There's all this data, there's all these algorithms, there's people that are trading and then bots that are trading. And it's just very, very it's so cool. And all of these exchanges have open APIs. And I was like, man, it would be cool to pull in all that data and do something with it. A, because that's a high scale problem. Like, how am I going to store all that data? That's kind of exciting. And then B, because hey, maybe you can build an algorithm or do something cool with trading. I think that would be an interesting problem. So it was more like, not like, I'm interested because I think I'm going to solve a problem and fix the world, because I think that trading the coins actually provides no value to the world, but it more so this is a really cool and fun thing to work on that gives you an exposure to a lot of technology and a lot of different high skill problems, which gets me excited. So even though maybe I build these, I build tools and stuff for the blockchain and I lose money doing it, it's just fun because it's such a tough problem to crack, and it pushes all those sort of buttons in my ADHD head that makes me really interested in it.
Tell me more about some of those problems that you're trying to solve and what kinds of tools you're building. I know you mentioned you're trying to gather and filter a lot of that data. How do you even solve that problem? How do you get started?
The most difficult problem is that there's a lot of data ingestion. If you want to collect every trade that happens on every platform, you're talking about a stream that's hundreds of megabytes per minute of trade data coming in. And if you want to do it right, you need to ingest all that and you need to process it, make some decision on it, and store it somewhere. So it's like that, there's this comic, and it's this big semi-truck with a little toy Tonka truck strapped to the back bed, and that's the only thing it's carrying, and it says when you run WordPress on Kubernetes. And I felt in some ways I wanted to do that. So I built this huge Kubernetes deployment to run my software on AWS, and all the new shiny technology. It's this is all the stuff I'm going to use. So the thing that I have spent most of my time on is the data ingestion engine, which is in Elixir, which was a new language for me. It was use all the new things that I don't even know how to use yet. And so built this pretty massive data ingestion pipeline that all these exchanges have their own APIs, and some of them use WebSockets, and some use this weird WebSocket thing I never heard of made by Microsoft, but it's their own spin on it. So you need to write a client library for that. And then just pulling in all this data and doing it in a way where your program can scale, it can be distributed across multiple containers in your cluster, and then taking that data and then storing it somewhere and putting it in a queue, so then you can have different other programs act on that data without having to have their own data ingestion system. So I've built this entire pipeline to suck in all this data from all of these exchanges. And it's fun because it's such high scale, right? Because you're talking about millions, tens of millions of data points coming in per day of all these transactions and making sense of that.
You said that one of the reasons you wanted to use Elixir for this project is because you'd never used it in the past. Was there any other reason why you wanted to do that? I could definitely see a lot of value in that kind of language, but was there a specific reason that drove you towards using Elixir?
Elixir is one of those new hot technologies that a lot of people are talking about. And it looked to me at first glance, I have a background in Ruby on Rails is my go-to sort of framework and language. And Elixir caught my eye as a faster replacement. Elixir, and there's a framework called Phoenix, as a faster replacement to Ruby on Rails. It's on the Erlang VM, which is like this virtual machine made by, I think, Ericsson or one of the big cell phone company, or not phone companies, that runs a lot of their phone infrastructure, and it's made for high concurrency and high availability. So it can do a lot of interesting paradigms that you don't see, but I just saw it as Elixir is built on that, and you look at it on the website and you say, wow, this is just like Ruby, but it's faster. And then you dive in, and I think most people that learn Elixir go through this. You dive in and you learn it's nothing like Ruby. The syntax looks like Ruby, but it's totally functional. There's no objects. It has like a lot of these new paradigms in programming that you're not used to seeing. And maybe some people will get mad and say, oh, but actually the thing you're going to talk about, Steve, like Smalltalk had that 20 years ago or something. But my background is, C and PHP and sort of the declarative languages that I grew up learning. And so learning these new paradigms, I'm like, whoa, I've never seen anything like that. So Elixir doesn't really have variables in the true sense. It has these things where you can bind. All the data is immutable. So you can bind data to a name, but it's not a variable in the sense that you think about a variable. And you can do this weird pattern matching stuff. And it's all of these, you use it as a programmer, you're like, holy crap, that's like, my mind is blown. I didn't even know that was a thing that you could even think of doing. Like, if, for example, in like Java, you may have a function and you can overload that function where you can have add, and add can take an integer, and then you can have an overloaded version of that. Add takes a string, and you have different implementations, right? And when you call add, it's matching it based on the type. Is it a string or is it an int? And that's how it decides which implementation to use. In Elixir, you can actually match, instead of just matching on type like int or string, you can match on the value of that data. So you can put, instead of like taking a variable name where it's just a type, you can say, I want to call this function, and the only way you match this is if you pass a string called Steve. And you can have a different function implementation for a bunch of different strings. And you can match within sort of arrays and within maps. And so it's this weird paradigm, and it's very powerful. The other thing you can do is you can actually, while the program is running, you can load in your new code without shutting the program down. And all of the current threads or actors, as they're called in Elixir, all the current actors will run the old implementation, but any new ones that start will use your new implementation. So it has this weird high availability aspect because you can push new code without ever shutting down the program and just doing hot reloads. So I just got really into it, and you learn all these whole new paradigms. And at first, you're like, your first reaction is, wow, this is just like Ruby, but it's really fast. Your second reaction is, holy crap, this is totally different. Your third reaction is, wow, I hate this. Like, I want to do this thing that would be simple in another language, non-functional, and it's really difficult to do in Elixir, like store global state. There's a lot of boilerplate to make that happen. And then you get over that hump of like, oh, I hate this because it's so different, and you kind of fall in love with it. And you're like, wow, this is a very elegant way to design distributed systems. It just so happened that that was the perfect tool for building this highly available, highly concurrent data pipeline. But I did not do that on purpose. It was just an accident that it happened to be the right tool for the job that I was doing.
I can definitely see a lot of value in playing around with different technologies like that, especially new, maybe not necessarily cutting edge, but newer established technologies that are helping a lot of different companies. The problem with that though is, how do you find the time to learn how these new technologies work, or even some of the benefits that they have, especially when you're working your day-to-day job and you've got deadlines, you might be stressed out. How do you make the time to even play with these technologies and see if they're a good fit for what you're doing or not?
The first thing I'd say is, the only way I can really learn a technology and really know it is to build something with it. And I have to find a project, and it has to be a project that gets me excited. I have sort of my mind is where I'm either intensely focused on something or apathetic and completely disinterested. And so I have to find that thing that really I can just really focus on it and really dive in. And then when I kind of get that feeling where I know, okay, this is an idea or a project that gets me really excited, then I can say, what's on that technology back burner that I want to learn? This is a good way where the enthusiasm of the project will keep me pushing, even though I may get frustrated when you're learning Docker for the first time. You're like just pulling your hair out, and you're like, this makes no sense. It's just much easier to not use Docker. And you have to kind of push through that before you see the benefits and you get into a productive workflow. So finding that enthusiastic project is what gives me the ability to push through and learn something. As for finding the time, what I did when I was in San Francisco, and there's a bunch of different ways I've seen people do this, but there's the concept of like an artist day or an artist appointment for yourself, where you say, okay, every Sunday between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., that's my time to sit down and work on a project or learn something or go do something creative. And I think that when you do that and you have that scheduled and it's pre-planned, it creates this forcing function where you actually do it. If you just say, oh, I'm going to do that sometime this week, you'll never do it. You'll never find the time to sit down, because you never find the time. You have to make the time. So actually, when I lived in SF, I did that all day Sunday. Sunday was my focus day, and I had sort of a routine where I would walk to the store and I'd buy like some prepared food so I wouldn't have to cook or be distracted, and I'd buy a kombucha. Like, for some reason, that was just part of my routine, and I didn't want to mess it up because I really liked that schedule. So I would try to just do everything in the same order that I always did. Walk to the store, get food, buy a kombucha, come home, and then focus on whatever I wanted to learn that entire day. And because it was scheduled, I did it. As far as determining what are the technologies that are worth investing your time in, I think that the biggest way that I identify those and find them is I'm never the earliest adopter. I wait till I see some momentum, and I read a lot of Hacker News and different programming subreddits. And I'll read about everything that's coming out. So I may read an article about Elixir, and I'll kind of just give it a glance, and I'll spend 10 or 20 minutes just, okay, now I can talk about it, but I've never used it. And do that when I see new technologies. And then if I see it keep popping up, if I keep hearing about it, if I read, how so-and-so company is using Elixir, it starts to, as it pops up more on my radar, I think, okay, maybe I want to give that a shot and check it out. But I will never jump in and sort of be the first one to use a language or to use a new tool, just because there's so many of them. And if you do that, you'll spread yourself so thin that you'll never learn any of them.
You actually have a really good example of this in your own life and career with TwitPic, because at the time that you joined it, the application itself had a lot of users coming onto it, and so the application or infrastructure may not have been able to handle that load, and the CEO and founder maybe didn't have that expertise to be able to help with it. So you came on board and you helped fix it. So how do you learn on the fly when things are breaking and you've got to figure it out?
I think that you said the CEO, founder and CEO, didn't have the technical expertise, but honestly, neither of us did. I was, fresh out of getting kicked out of college. I was laid off at my job before at an ad company, And I joined, and I honestly had no idea what I was doing, and things kept breaking even while I was there, and things that I tried at the time and different technical solutions that I thought, oh, this is a good idea, would break, and looking back, I say, oh, that actually wasn't a good idea. But it was that learning on the job experience. It was making a lot of mistakes. It was pouring in my entire waking hours of my day, where I would wake up and I would sit down and start coding, and I wouldn't get off the computer until I went to bed, and that's when I stopped coding. And just learning over and over again and making mistakes. And the thing that I learned is that what you may do at a certain point in a company, either technical or culture or hiring, people management, it's all the same in terms of this problem. But the thing that you do at, say, 5 people doesn't work at 10 people, and that doesn't work at 20 people, and that doesn't work at 50 people, that doesn't work at all. So you have to keep evolving, and the things that you used to do that were like the best ideas before, at a different size, maybe the worst idea or the worst thing you can do. So you have to know that you're always going to be evolving the way you think about things, like I said, tech and culture-wise, because the same way you have this problem scaling tech, the same way you have this problem scaling people, is that you just have to be open-minded enough to know that you're going to make bad decisions, you're going to have to redo things many times over as you grow. And I think that, like, learning hands-on that way gave me a really good perspective of how you can keep building, and how a company can go from 10 people to 1,000 people. And you kind of look at these companies at scale, and you think that they just do it. They just kind of, it's this linear pattern, but in reality, it's these ups and downs as you change things every step of the way.
What advice would you give to a manager who maybe hasn't been in this position before, and now they have a team of engineers, and as they grow that team, a lot of the communication breaks down, a lot of the processes that worked for employee number 5, 10, etc., don't work anymore at the stage that they're at. What advice would you give them to be able to structure that better, to create the right processes, and to scale that as the team continues to scale as well?
A good friend of mine, he says that engineering is a people problem, meaning the hardest part of growing an engineering team and being productive and scaling at a certain size is managing the teams, managing the people, keeping everyone happy, keeping the way people work productive and healthy. And I agree with that. I think that one of the hardest parts especially when you're starting off, like that kind of march from, say, one person where you're the only person writing code, you're a new startup, it's just you're building the product, you know everything. That march to 10 people is pretty much every new person in the team, the way you communicate changes dramatically. When you're one person, you know everything, you don't have to communicate with anyone. When you're 2 people, now you have someone else, but you can just say, hey, this is what I'm thinking, and they say, cool, and then that's it. You're not documenting anything, you're just this one-to-one communication. When you have 3 people, now you have, maybe I tell you something, but I forgot to tell the other person, and you start to have a little bit of lossiness with the way the team communicates. And then that kind of grows exponentially, and I think a lot of teams get stuck with that early on, and they start, and you have the founders that were there maybe earlier, the first or second people, they have, sort of this, they've built all the initial stuff, so they kind of are trying to control everything, and you have this delegation piece that can be a pain. When learning that can be a pain, not delegating, but like learning to delegate is hard. And the way that you build the teams and you structure the team and you have everyone communicate, every person you hire is going to change that dramatically. So maybe you start off, you're in an office and you're just shouting across the office, and then you move to Slack, and then you move to Jira, and you kind of start keeping track of work. That all happens really fast in the beginning, and you don't want to overburden it with being too heavy-handed on process either. That's the other thing that can hurt a startup, is you have 5 people and you just overburden yourself with process and you get nothing done, and you lose the advantage of being a startup where you can move fast because you don't have much process.
You mentioned that delegation is super hard, and this is something that a lot of people struggle with, especially first-time managers. What advice do you have to give them so that that could help them just delegate to their own engineers and offload a lot of their workload that they have?
The most difficult part of delegation, especially as a founder, is lack of trust in a lot of ways. Like, that's what I think causes problems as an early employer, as a founder, is that you want to trust the team or the people that you've hired, but it's really hard to let go, and it's unfounded, right? It's lack of trust for just because you're scared. It's your own kind of ego that you're struggling with. And I think if you can recognize that, if you can look at it logically and introspectively and say, okay, the reason why I'm having trouble letting you do this work, or not micromanaging, or letting you take this idea and running with it, is because I'm afraid that it's not going to be as good as what I could do. Not because you're a bad engineer, but because I'm the founder and I know everything about this product. And I think that the only way you overcome that, and the only way you let the team succeed, is by allowing people on your team to have your entire trust, to say, here is a project, or here is a feature, or whatever. I want you to take it and run with it and see it all the way through. And I'm going to trust that you're going to produce something good. And that empowers people. And then, of course, advising along the way and saying, hey, have you thought about this? But not being overburdening. And then the way that your team grows and the way that your team gets better is because you've empowered them and they've been able to take these problems and run with it and solve them, and maybe not in the most optimal, best way in the beginning. And I think that's okay. Everything doesn't need to be solved in the best way possible, right? Sometimes it just needs to be solved. But giving them that experience and then allowing them to grow gives them confidence, gives them experience, and then also, as the person delegating, gives you more and more trust that in the future, the thing that they're going to produce or work on, you don't need to even think about it because they're going to take it and run with it. But it's really, it all starts internally as the person delegating, that you have to give up control, and that's healthy and that's good, and that other people can work on your company or work on your product, and they're going to be good at it. Right? You're not the only one that can be good at it.
At TwitPic, you had a smaller team, it was a younger platform, but when you moved over as chief architect to BigCommerce, that was a more established platform, a more established company and team overall. What was that transition like?
It was really, really difficult at first. Coming from TwitPic, I came from a handful of engineers. They were all my friends. They were people that I hung out with on the weekends. So it was more like a family and people that I just would hang out with even if I wasn't working with them. And really productive, really small team, and I love that. And then moving to a big company, I will say I've made so many mistakes because I kind of had that same mindset. I didn't realize that at such a larger amount of people, hundreds of people, that there's all of these people, communication problems and things you have to think about. And so the things that I did at TwitPic, a lot of that didn't necessarily translate to working at a larger company. And one of the mistakes I made when I came in early in, I would say, okay, we're gonna do blah, 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 and we're gonna use this technology. And at a small company that works, you can just kind of hash it out. At a big company, though, you're just, when you do that at a sort of management function, you're just dictating what we're going to use, and that's actually a way to build a bad culture and communication. And that was one of the mistakes I struggled with early on. Is sort of, I knew that okay, we're going to do this. This is the right technology to solve it, but dictating it and not explaining why and not communicating with the whole team in a way where it's not just sitting down with a couple of engineers and explaining it, but putting it in a way where it can be consumed by hundreds of people that are working at the company, and they can say, okay, let them come to their own conclusion of why we should use a certain technology or whatever, instead of just saying, this is what we're going to use. So that was really the hardest thing for me, transitioning to such a a bigger company is just the way that you interact with the teams is totally different, because there's still only one of you, but there are so many people that are listening to what you're saying, and the things that you say has a large impact on their day-to-day job. And if someone is frustrated or they disagree with you, maybe you say, hey, we're going to use Go for this project, and you don't. In my case, I didn't do a good job of explaining why, and they're frustrated, but they don't necessarily have a great outlet to say, hey, actually, I disagree with that choice, and here are the reasons why. Where with a team of 5 people, they can say, hey, can I talk to you real quick? Listen, I think that's a bad idea. But when there's this massive team, and maybe they don't necessarily, maybe there's a layer of management between you and them, it can be really annoying for them to have someone just dictate what we're going to use. So I think for me, it was just, I needed to become a better communicator, and I did not do a good job of that in the beginning.
That's really awesome advice, Steve. Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit more information about your own day-to-day life at BigCommerce? What was that like? What did you work on? What did you do?
So my role there was chief architect. So I had a team of architects that I worked really closely with, and software architect means so many different things at so many companies. I kind of hate the term a little bit, because I think it has this connotation that the software architect is like someone that's better than an engineer or something like that. Which is not the case, right? It's just my day-to-day, what that looked like at BigCommerce was figuring out what the technical strategy was for the software for the company, how we were going to build things with what technologies, how that evolves, how we take the technology that we have right now, and how do we take where we want to go as far as what technologies do we want to use in the future, and bridge that gap. Because with a big software company, you can't do something like, hey, we're going to rewrite the app, right? You can't do that. But you want to evolve the technology, you want to change things. Maybe choices that you made or previous employees made in the past, they didn't scale with the way that, the way we're using the software now, or the way that the company's going. So you have to kind of look at that technology and come up with a strategy of how you get from A to B. One of the things that we were doing at BigCommerce was it was a monolithic PHP application with about, I want to say, 1.5 million lines or 2 million lines of code, and just one big application. And we had enough people where it made sense to split that application up into microservices. And so a lot of my day-to-day was spent working with teams of what parts of the app become a microservice, what are the different domains that, it was a shopping cart app. So what parts of those are standalone services, and then how do we, over time, without any downtime, without changing the way the product behaves, without introducing more bugs, how do we extract functionality from the monolithic app, maybe build it in another language, maybe keep it in PHP, but how do we extract that, put on a clean, RESTful API or something, and create a service that is standalone and outside of the monolithic app. So most of my day-to-day was just working with people and talking through, for different areas of the product, how is that split up? How is that broken out of that monolithic application?
I mentioned in the intro that you're advising startups. What led you to advising, and what attracts you to that?
I advise a couple companies that are really interesting problems to me, or companies where I really like the founders, and I think that they're gonna be successful, whether it's this company or another one, that they have that drive, and I see something in them that I admire. I think where I see a lot of companies, especially early stage startups, which I really enjoy, where they struggle, especially with engineering, is that I see this mistake a lot. They will look for a CTO, and they will find someone that looks great on paper, that maybe has worked at some big software companies, they were managers, and they'll say, this person looks great, they have all the experience, they want to get into an early stage startup, and they bring in founders or people to run their engineering team, and that person had never had a startup background, and they're lost, and they want to take all that culture they know from that big company where you have layers of tools you have to use and time tracking just to do 5 minutes of work. There's 45 minutes of data entry and logging to kind of track that work, right? And they bring that kind of culture in way early in the company, which can kill a startup, because your biggest advantage as a startup is that you don't have as much process, that you can tap me on the shoulder and say, hey Steve, there's this weird bug, check this out, and I'm like, oh yeah, you're right, that is a bug, I know exactly what's causing it, type up some code, push deploy, and 20 minutes later we fix that problem. And a lot of people, I think, that don't come from a startup background or don't know that world, it's like kind of scary, because that's not tracked. We didn't log that bug, it's not in Jira, there's no paper trail, and that's important, but bringing all that stuff on too early can really, really, really put molasses in your engineering team productivity. And that's what I see a lot of my advice to startups, especially on the engineering side, would be practice good software development hygiene, but take advantage of the sort of what you have as a team. Take advantage of that, because your bigger competitor with 100 employees, they don't have that same advantage. They can't just take code and ship it 20 minutes later. And that's not good practice for a huge team, but it's really, really empowering when you're small, and it gives you a huge leg up to be able to ship fast and to be able to try new things and to be able to move fast, where you have a small enough team where y'all can get in a room and talk about it real quick and say, cool, let's do it. And that's all the decision making that needs to happen. And that's all the talking about it needs to happen. So that's my advice for startups. And that's what I tell the companies that advise and help them not make that mistake.
All right, last question. When are you writing your new book?
What I would like to do, I know nothing about machine learning, nothing about it. But I know that it's important. I know that a lot of people want to learn it. So what I've been thinking about is a problem that I want to solve, I think involves machine learning. And what I would be really cool, and I think this is a course or a book that I want to produce, is it will be sort of my journal of me solving that problem with machine learning while I'm learning it. So like chapter 1 would be like, what the hell is machine learning? And it'll be like, this is what I think machine learning is, and then maybe go back and update it once I actually know more about it and say, actually, I was completely wrong. I thought machine learning was X, Y, Z, and actually it's this whole other thing. So I would like to do something like that, where it's a journal of me solving a real project, a real problem with machine learning as I learn it. And I think that will be really valuable to people that are in the same boat as me, that would like to learn it, don't know where to start, want something practical and hands-on that they can follow along, don't need to necessarily know the nitty-gritty, super manual details. They just want to know, I have a problem, how do I solve it with this technology? So that's what I'm thinking, but no promises that I'll actually do that.
Steve, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. If people want to follow up with you, or if they want to keep track of those projects you're working on, how do you recommend they do that?
They can check out my blog at stevecorona.com, or I'm on Twitter at StevenCorona.
Thank you again, Steve. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for tuning in to the Scale Your Code Show, and see you next time.